of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can see a selection of appropriate channels for interpretation, either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order to the best of our ability. We appreciate your patience and understanding in these regards. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee is resuming its study on government's regulatory reform initiative in agriculture and agri-food. And I would now like to welcome our witnesses. From the Canadian Grain Council, we have Mac Ross. From the Canadian Meat Council, Claire Citeau. Did I pronounce it? It's very close to my name. Nice name, Koto. And Jorge Carrera. And from Crop Life Canada, Emily Bergeon and Gregory Colts, Vice President, Government Affairs. So welcome. You all have, each organization has 5 minutes, and then we'll go into rotations between the different members, the different parties to ask questions. So who would like to start? Maybe we'll just go to Mr. Ross online. 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity and invitation to appear today. As noted, my name is Mac Ross, and I'm the Vice President of Trade Policy and Crop Protection with the Canada Grains Council. The Canada Grains Council is a national organization representing the entire grain value chain, including Canadian farmers, seed and life science companies, exporters, and all major field crop commodity associations. I'm pleased to appear here today as the committee study on government's regulatory reform initiative in agriculture and agri-food concerns an area that is critical to the success of our sector. While the Canadian grain sector already accounts for an annual economic impact of $172 billion, reducing red tape is imperative to further unleashing the economic potential of our sector. Canada's heavy regulatory burden is slowing investment, innovation, and growth across our sector. Canada currently ranks near the bottom of OECD countries on administrative and regulatory burden, and that puts our competitiveness at risk. This is a serious concern for the grain sector, which has further potential to be a major economic driver for Canada if it's empowered rather than constrained. To achieve this, Canadian regulations must be modern, efficient, and aligned with economic growth objectives that allow farmers, exporters, and innovators to compete on a global stage. Canadian farmers, as you know, have a tremendous capacity and eagerness to adopt and implement modern plant science innovation like crop protection products and seed innovation. These tools help Canadian farmers sustainably intensify their productive capacity, positively contributing to the Canadian economy and food security at home and abroad. Canadian farmers rely both on the PMRA and the CFIA to gain timely access to these tools and to support trade. As a relatively small market, we can't afford to have a regulatory system that is more expensive, less predictable, and mired in more red tape than our competitors. If we're serious about boosting Canadian competitiveness and economic growth, we need to make sure our regulatory approaches align with our strategic objectives as a country. As such, the Canada Grains Council proposes the following 5 no-cost changes at both PMRA and CFIA to ensure regulations that support a growth agenda for Canada. First, requiring the PMRA to consider food security and economic impacts in all their regulatory decisions without compromising on health and safety. Second, instructing the PMRA to leverage reviews and best regulatory practices from other trusted risk-based jurisdictions to remove duplication and keep Canadian farmers competitive. Third, deliver world-leading regulatory performance standards by requiring the PMRA to meet 100% of its performance targets. Fourth, sunset the PMRA's transformation agenda, which has been underway since 2021, and refocus PMRA resources on delivering core mandate activities. And lastly, regarding the CFIA, expedite the CFIA's development and full adoption of electronic phytosanitary certificate, or ePhyto, exchange for both import and export of grain with our participating international trading partners. Unfortunately, Canada is currently behind many of our competitors in making this transition. So at a time when the global trading environment is increasingly volatile, Canada can't afford to have quote unquote own goals by way of our own domestic regulatory burden. We believe these 5 no-cost recommendations for PMRA and CFIA will help create a regulatory environment in Canada that moves at the speed of commerce and provides timely access to innovation for Canadian farmers. This will be an important study for our sector, and we look forward to playing an active role as it takes shape, and we thank all members in advance for taking this important work seriously. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to the Canadian Meat Council for 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du comité.
Mr. Chair, thank you for your invitation. I am Claire Cito, and we are the voice for all meat producers in Canada. It is one of the biggest organizations in Canada. We provide protein products through 90% of exportation. The Canadian sector is diversified. It includes major companies and small and medium-sized companies.
Headwinds, punitive Chinese tariffs, persistent labor shortages, shifting international trade rules, and livestock supply pressures that leave processors operating on rather thin margins. The sector is inherently dependent on trade for carcass utilization and to get better value for our products internationally. With over half of Canadian meat production destined for exports, including to the US, China, Japan, Mexico, and South Korea, amongst others. And I will now turn it over to my colleague.
Good afternoon. My name is Jorge Correa. I'm Vice President of Market Access and Technical Affairs of the Canadian Meat Council. To build resilience and safeguard the sector's contribution to Canada's food system, economic growth, and rural employment, we recommend the following. Finance priorities. Meat processing resilience funds. Amend the Agri-Stability Program to support federally regulated meat processors facing supply-driven negative margins, ensuring processors have access to risk management programs comparable to those available to producers. Prioritize trade diversification and market access. Extend the agri-marketing funding envelope to strengthen industry engagement abroad, including initiatives such as the first Industry Canadian Meat Advocacy Office in China, renewed support for the Indo-Pacific Agri-Food Office, and funding to help industry meet foreign regulatory requirements. China tariffs compensations. Engage substantially with China to reopen the market to beef, remove tariffs on pork, and provide compensation of offset the 25% retaliatory tariffs on Canada pork, which represents $177 million in annual losses. Comparable compensation has been extended to other sectors. Ensure CFIA has the resources and the expertise, both domestically and in the Canadian embassies abroad, to keep exports moving and streamline inspection through digitalization and AI-assisted tools, e-certification, and clearer guidance to ensure national regulatory consistency. We recommend the following urgent regulatory reforms. Exempt meat inspection from BSEAL 5 unless provincial systems are demonstrably equivalent to federal standards. Align the enhanced feed ban program with the U.S. standards. CFIA estimates this change could save the processing sector $25 million annually. Extend the labor market impact assessment, known as LMIA, validity to to 2 years, continue supporting the provincial nominee program, which is managed by provinces, and create a sector-specific immigration stream to stabilize the workforce. Invest in preparedness and response for foreign animal diseases, including African swine fever and foot and mouth disease. Implement the recommendations of the Industrial Inquiry Commission on the West Coast ports within the Fall 2025 Budget Implementation Act to prevent disruptions that hurt agri-food exports. Mr. Chair, Canada's meat sector is proud of its food safety record and of the role it plays feeding Canadians and the world. But regulatory inefficiencies are real barriers to competitiveness and growth. Solutions exist, and because of the fate of our industry is so closely tied to that of the regulator, so those solutions that would unlock savings and efficiencies for industry will also create savings and efficiencies for the government. Ultimately, we look forward to continuing to work with government to maintain world-class standards, reduce unnecessary costs, and strengthen Canada's position as a global agri-food leader. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we'll go to CropLife Canada for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honourable members. My name is Gregory Coles, Vice President of Government Affairs at CropLife Canada, and I'm joined today by my colleague Émilie Bergeron, Vice President of Chemistry. Thank you for inviting us to appear today as part of your ongoing study of the government's regulatory reform initiative in agriculture and agri-food sector. CropLife Canada is the national voice of the manufacturers, developers, and distributors of pesticides and plant breeding innovations. Our members deliver critical solutions that support Canadian farmers as they grow food for Canadians and the world, and drive economic growth for Canada. Our members are poised and ready to deliver much-needed innovations to help reignite productivity growth in the agriculture sector. But in order to do so, they need the right regulatory environment. This past July, CropLife Canada was pleased to see the Government of Canada initiate its red tape review. The federal government's efforts to streamline services, cut duplication, and reduce costs for Canadians and businesses comes at a critical time for the agriculture industry and the plant science sector specifically. Canada's agriculture and agri-food industry is a vital part of our economy and our food security. The industry contributes almost $150 billion annually to our GDP and employs 2.3 million Canadians. That's more than the automotive, forestry, steel and aluminum, and oil and gas sectors combined. We are the largest manufacturing sector in the country and a key driver of domestic economic growth. That said, if Canada's economy is to become the strongest in the G7, it will need the agriculture and food sector to flourish and grow. While the sector already accounts for 7% of the country's GDP, the opportunity exists for the sector to double its contributions over the next 10 years. We believe that much of this opportunity lies in low-hanging fruit, including implementing several no-cost measures that improve the efficiency of the regulatory system and ensure farmers have timely access to the innovative seed and crop protection tools they need to increase productivity and compete in the global marketplace.
Although the recent report on reducing red tape of Health Canada, of the CFIA, and of the PMRA indicates a willingness to reduce regulatory burden, the recommendations relating to innovations in plant science are disappointing and will do little to eliminate red tape and stimulate economic growth. Simply put, it is urgent that the government take bold and decisive action. Health and safety will always be of the utmost importance, but we must collectively strike a balance between risk-based regulation and growth-based regulation. With regards to the PMRA, the challenges are particularly significant. Each year, the number of new product registration applications submitted to the PMRA has declined by half compared to a decade ago, but approval times have nearly doubled. This damages Canada's reputation as a global leader in regulation and puts Canadian farmers at a disadvantage. It already takes nearly 12 years for a new crop protection product to reach a market from initial research and development to regulatory approval. Each additional year of delay means lost opportunities for farmers who may suffer devastating losses from pests that could have been prevented by innovation that was stuck in bureaucratic red tape.
Belief that there is a clear need for enabling regulations that support Canadian innovation and competitiveness while promoting fiscal responsibility and efficiency in resource utilization. This is why we are recommending that the government focus on eliminating redundant bureaucratic processes such as the PMRA transformation agenda and refocus resources on delivering timely approvals of new crop protection tools and predictable and risk-based reevaluation decisions, ensuring Canadian farmers have access to innovative products and technologies to produce safe and abundant food and feed. As the government looks to drive more investment and innovation in Canada, we must ensure that the regulatory system is positioned to handle an increase in new product submissions and reevaluations. This will require efficient, predictable, modern regulatory approaches that are as innovative as the products that they are designed to regulate. The plant science industry stands ready and willing to work with the government to create a path forward where we have a world-leading regulatory system that maintains high standards for health and safety while also enabling timely access to innovative products. Thank you for your time. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was right on time, so we appreciate that. Thank you. We'll go over to the Conservatives now to start the beginning of a 6-minute round for each of the parties. We'll start with Mr. Barlow.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to having the witnesses here on what is a very important process for us to go through. Last week we had the officials from CFIA and PMRA here, and my first question to them is are plans underway for you to meet the Liberal government's mandate for you to adjust your mandate to include economic impact and ensure the decisions that you make have economic growth as part of that process? Both the officials of CFIA and PMRA said there is no reason for them to change their mandates, as those things are already within their purview. I would argue that that's absolutely not happening, but would you agree? I guess we'll start with CropLife. Would you agree with that assessment, that there's no need for CFIA and PMRA to change their mandates?
I believe we would disagree with that assertion, Mr. Chair. Yes, it does appear in the preamble. There's no questioning that. That is a valid statement. Unfortunately, however, it does not seem to be taken into consideration as much as we believe it should. And therefore, we do believe that they should look at maintaining health and safety as the priority, but they also need to ensure that the economic and competitive lens is applied to their decisions. And this is also consistent with a commitment that the government made in their recent platform, talking about ensuring that they recognize the cost of food in all of their regulatory decisions without compromising on health and safety, and therefore we want to hold them to account on that promise.
Mac, you said, Mr. Ross, you said something similar in your presentation. Would you agree or disagree with the statement of the officials of CFI and PMRA in terms of economic impact in their mandate?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would disagree with the assertion that promise does not need to be fulfilled and that the mandate doesn't need to be changed. I think, as mentioned already, health and safety will always be of the utmost importance, but we need to find the appropriate balance between regulating for risk and regulating for growth.
Thank you. I'm going to go to CropLife again. We had a recent decision by the PMRA again on dicamba, which sounds very similar to what we went through with Lambda Psi, decisions on neonics. It seems like we're always having these proposed label changes being published before the scientific discussion or assessments or even been completed. That is having consequences within the agriculture industry. I guess to you a question would be, why do we continue to be running into these same problems? Why is this always happening? What is the impact on your members and producers? And what needs to be done to ensure that these decisions are made in the proper sequence, that we don't continue to have these problems as we have with dicamba, Lambda Psi, and neonics?
Yeah, this is a long-standing issue that we have with PMRA, and that is why we were so disappointed when we saw the red tape reduction report from the PMRA. We were expecting them to talk about improvement needed to the reevaluation process, which led to the dicamba decision and other that you name over the years. We were so concerned as well because we had these discussions with PMRA for the past 10 years about how to improve the reevaluation system, how to build efficiencies in the program, so that these black box, this lack of transparency, these decisions that comes without information or discussion with the registrant and with the ag industry on what will be the impact and the science behind what is the decision never happen. And what we've been proposing to the PMRA for a long time now, I said 10 years, I think it's more than that, is really to have a step before the proposed decision where they release the risk assessment, very similar to what is going on in the U.S. The U.S. does that, where they stop at the risk assessment, have a discussion with the registrant and agricultural industry on the risk, what is at stake, new science that may emerge that may help make a better decision, and then they move on with the process. And the PMRA so far hasn't agreed to move into that direction, but we feel that now today with this new decision, which kind of again show the importance of going back to the discussion and having a clear review or comprehensive review of how to improve the reevaluation system.
Thank you, Ms. Bergeron. And maybe another question to all of the witnesses here is, Ms. Bergeron, you brought up the red tape reduction report brought forward by the government. But we also had Agriculture Canada's officials here last week admit that there was no formal consultation process. And you kind of mentioned it, that when the report was presented, you were expecting to see some things in there that were not there. I just want to confirm, and maybe each one of you can answer, and we'll start with CropLife. Were you approached as part of a formal consultation process into this red tape reduction report? Yes or no?
I can confirm that we were not consulted during the process.
Meat Council, Claire, were you? Yes. You were consulted? Mac, were you had official consultation as part of the red tape reduction report?
We were not approached for official consultation.
Okay, it's interesting. Some were and some weren't, considering that you would be two of the most critical stakeholder representatives within that. And lastly, I've got about 30 seconds here. I just wanted to, on PMRA, again to CropLife, as part of, you mentioned the transformation agenda quite extensively. This is going to be additional costs 4 times higher than what the United States is being charged. Have they explained to you what these additional funds are going to be used for? And you going to see any better service as a result of these $80 million in additional fees being charged? Thank you.
We were intrigued by the response given last week, whereby I believe one of the officials said they were hopeful that the funds would be used to help improve services. But to this point, there are no guarantees. And in fact, it remains unclear what the plan is exactly to ensure that they can actually meet the standards that they are supposed to.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Chair.
you. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to the Liberals for 6 minutes. MP Chatel.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. One of the common objectives of this committee and of this study is, as you mentioned earlier, to compare what the departments published in September with your feedback on those recommendations and get your recommendations. So thank you to those who have published recommendations. I will start with Mr. Ross. Same question as my colleague, even though I do believe that you already answered it. Leading up to in the preamble of the mandate, we already have a focus on the economy, but how can we go even further? When you say it doesn't go far enough, what are you getting at? It would help us if you were a bit more clear. Mr. Ross, in your first recommendation, you mentioned that you talk about modifying the mandate of the PMRA in order for it to take into consideration food security and the economy. It is mentioned in the preamble. You want to modify the mandate. Do you have any clear suggestions? You can submit those in writing because I do have many questions and I want to get through all of them. Mr. Ross, in your second recommendation, you talk about learning from various regulations that come from other reliable administrative bodies. Other officials have said to us that they've made a lot of progress in doing a joint evaluation with the EU, the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. They have also had mutual agreements as well. Is that a step in the right direction? Do you want to go further than that, or much further than that? Can you tell us what your recommendation would be in that context?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. To address the first part of that question around requiring the PMRA to consider food security and economic impacts in their regulatory decisions, we do feel that there's room to be more ambitious in that regard. And as far as the means how to accomplish this, I think there's different ways to achieve this, and ultimately that's for the government to decide how to proceed. But from our perspective, achieving the outcome, which is requiring PMRA to consider food security, economic impacts in all of their regulatory decisions, is more important than the means to arrive to that outcome. So we think there's still work to do there in ensuring that, as we said earlier, finding the balance between regulating for risk and regulating for growth. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. To your second question around the work to leverage reviews and best regulatory practices from other trusted and risk-based jurisdictions. We think that there has been some positive steps in that direction. You referenced joint reviews for one, but we feel that there can be more ambition to do more in that regard, as we really feel it'll remove duplication. The benefits are twofold there. It's an efficiency driver for the agency that has constrained resources and capacity. And secondly, it would ensure that Canadian farmers have access to the same tools as farmers in competing jurisdictions. And there's been times in the past where we've had a divergence of regulatory decisions on similar products. So I think definitely more needs to be done in that regard.
Merci. Et oui, Monsieur Cole.
Thank you. Mr. Colds, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. But I'd also like to hear what you have to say about the backlog. Officials last week said that they were going to fix that issue. What are you waiting for? Is there a minimum requirement? Is there a certain standard that you're trying to reach? What kind of tools do you need in order to reach those objectives?
I will start off by saying that the recommendations that were put forward back in early September were underwhelming at best. And to the point made earlier that they didn't consult with us during the process, most of what they're discussing currently are things that have been discussed for years. And their timeline for implementation is years down the road. So both of those things combined are concerning. So there seems to be a lack of ambition. But in terms of the backlog, I'll let Émilie touch on that.
Oui, on a un grand enjeu avec le...
There's a huge issue with the backlog, especially with approvals and new product certifications. The PMRA was here last week talking about their 72% performance. It is decreasing and has been for the past few years. In parallel, when we see less and less active ingredients being presented to the PMRA for certification, we do have some suggestions, and they are rather technical. We can table them with you, and it would be great for the PMRA to follow the law and get back to this regulation by still respecting various regulations with regards to human health and the environment, that they could be more predictable and work more quickly. This is a priority for us. The PMRA also mentioned that they are not the only organization having these issues. They talked about the United States, but they did not explain the context. The context is very different in the United States than it is in Canada. Microphone. There are about 58,000 pest control products in the United States, but we have about 7,000 here.
Cette information-là sur papier.
Yeah.
Merci.
Thank you so much. And next for 6 minutes, Bloc québécois, Monsieur Perron, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins d'être avec nous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the speakers for being here. Ms. Bergeron, you can finish that thought. I talked about the amount of products. There's 58,000 in the United States, but less than 8,000 in Canada. So the workload is quite different. The United States had a major transformation of the regulatory system in order to respond to a legal decree. This is something that the PMRA did not do, but what we saw at the PMRA was focus on producing or transformation of products. And since then, there's been a decrease in the performance of the PMRA. And so we do know that that does have an impact. That's why we were so disappointed in the red tape reduction report recommendations. There was nothing from the PMRA that would make them improve their performance. There was nothing in there either to improve the reevaluation program. Thank you for finishing that thought. It was quite relevant. We all want transparency. We want better labeling and so on. What you're saying is that the United States made some changes and improved their performance, but we haven't been able to do that in Canada. Have the United States increased their resources? What did they do? The United States are currently exchanging with the industry and various manufacturers in order to get the train back on the tracks with regards to their performance. There's a lot of collaboration, and they're seeking more innovative measures in order to improve performance, and they're working with AI tools, for example. They want more resources within the industry, not in terms of finance, but with or funding, but with regards to collaboration. Another thing that really helped with regards to improving evaluation performances is publishing the risk evaluation ahead of time. This is something we don't do in Canada. You touched on something quite delicate. When there are exchanges with the industry, I do understand that that's happening, but the state also has to be independent scientifically. How do you strike that balance? We've had some discussions on this in the past, and maybe we don't always agree. But how do you find a balance? We want to make sure that the state does not fail to take into consideration this independence. We can't only rely on the analysis that is provided. How do we strike that balance? In the reevaluation, it's very common for the PMRA to get all of the information that is available, and they look at what foreign organizations do. There is a program, for example, in place that will allow them to do this in a more public way. The PMRA has everything in place in order to make sure that they remain independent, and it is a very independent organization. Yes, there is data that comes from manufacturers, and the scientific standards do meet international standards, but maybe they can tell you how they actually do that, and it might answer some of your questions. They have tried, but I think they could do a little. They can do a little bit more. Well, I do agree with you on that. I'd like to hear you on the emergency requests. Last year we had the fruit and vegetable growers, and they said it could take up to 10 years to get some approvals. You said 12 years in your opening remarks, but that includes research and development. But if it's 10 years at the PMRA, then we can be talking about 20, 25 years. This doesn't really make any sense. What is happening here? Is it just inefficiency? How can we respond to those requests without risking people's health and safety? Because the emergency requests is an issue that was brought up. Sometimes there are some very pressing issues, but we need to temporarily use a product. They end up doing the evaluation, but once the authorization is given, well, the pests have already done their business and gone through the crop. Emergency certification is a very complex issue. The PMRA just went through a consultation, and the organization you mentioned had made some recommendations, and so did we. We hope that they will work with the industry to improve their processes. As you said, by the time the authorization is received, then the season is over. What we're asking for is for a more efficient process. We have some recommendations that I can share with you if you're interested. They aim to improve or make the process more efficient. We've been talking about it for years, and there's been no improvement. With the PMRA, there's a lot of exchange, but there's very little that is actually done to improve efficiency. Is it because of a lack of resources? Is it a question of just political will? We think that it's a question of culture, the way they work. What about sharing with other jurisdictions? I don't have much time left. For example, you share expertise with the U.S., and we each test different things and then share the information, and every jurisdiction can make their own final decision. What do you think of that? That's what we've been asking for. Other countries, for example, Australia, all have issues with regards to resources. They don't have enough resources. This is not quite what the PMRA is aiming for, but as Max said, we want to be more ambitious.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the Conservatives, Mr. Bragdon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each of the committee members for being here. It's an honor to be on the committee and to be able to ask these questions. And thanks for representing the various commodity groups and, of course, producers and farmers that you do. Obviously, challenging times in the field. I had an interesting meeting this morning with the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses and was quite taken with some of the findings that they've done as a result of some of the survey work they're doing amongst their, I think they consulted with over 100,000 of their members, and they talked about some of the constraints and some of the challenges that they're facing and finding amongst their independent business owners, of course, many of whom are farmers and producers, and they're being impacted by, obviously, the taxation policies that are in place and also some of the regulatory aspects that they're facing that are burdens on their back. And what's amazing, we're seeing a lot of increase of how much these are impacting them or acting as constraints. For example, it's a tax and regulatory cost, insurance cost, wage costs. They're finding product input costs, which, of course, many farmers can relate to and producers across the country, fuel costs, cost of borrowing, energy cost overall, many, many contributing factors. And what we'd like to hear from each of you from your various vantage points is, would you agree that the regulatory costs have been the primary financial burden for your respective industries that you represent? Has it been the regulatory as well as, I should say, the taxation burdens? Can you comment on that? What you're hearing from your producers? We'll start with you, Mr. Colts, and work our way across. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's undeniable that regulatory burden is it's having a hugely negative impact on the industry. And to the extent that we've been trying to work with government to put forward ideas that are either low cost or no cost and things that can be done relatively quickly, I think it speaks to what we said earlier in terms of a lack of ambition in some cases where, we can contemplate things for years and years, but until there is actual concrete action taken, those impacts will continue to be felt. And the transformation agenda, Emilie alluded to this in an earlier response, since it's been implemented in 2021, the efficiency rate has declined steadily. And so we think that by sunsetting the transformation agenda, that would be a very quick and relatively easy step towards reversing that trend.
Thank you. Ms. Bergeron, just before you begin your remarks, I did want to make sure you mentioned about the reports and suggestions regarding PMRAs that you folks have put together. Would you mind tabling that with the committee as well to make sure we have that information? And please proceed with answering the question as well.
My colleague already talked about that. Regulatory burden is a huge cost for our business. And as we said, we hope that we can go now, when we talk about red tape reduction, into really talking about how to make that system more efficient, because I think it's a lack of efficiency that really costs our members. When it's supposed to take 2 years to approve a new product, now it can take up to 6-7 years. Obviously, that has a huge impact on the performance of our members, as well as which products they decide to bring to Canada, and investment as well on the long term. So,
thank you. And very quickly, maybe one from the
Very
Me folks,
quickly,
yeah.
I think whether it's labor, input costs, regulatory burdens as well, one of our initiatives on the beef side is an alignment on the enhanced feed ban so that we maintain competitiveness with our U.S. counterparts in particular, something that has taken years to achieve. We're now on a good path. We want to maintain that momentum and hopefully get to a successful outcome shortly as well.
Okay.
Just to add briefly, inconsistent regulatory enforcement is creating burden in our industry, and we're looking for that consistent and enhanced communication from regulator to our members in the meat industry. But same situation for all industries.
Okay. And Matt?
Yeah, and I think the other panelists have covered this well, but maybe just one thing I'll note is that, when from a grain sector perspective, we export the vast majority of the product we grow here in Canada. So oftentimes, farmers are impacted by geopolitical factors that impact trade that are completely out of our control, right? That's why I think that the focus of this committee is so important, because when we're talking about the domestic regulatory environment, that's something that's within our control. This is, low-hanging fruit's been raised already. This is something that's within our own control to improve the profitability and competitiveness of our farmers. So I think, yes, the regulatory burden is heavy and is something that's within our own control to remedy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Mr. Connors, you're next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to welcome the witnesses here today, and thank you for coming. And as a person who worked in the agricultural industry for 14 years as an executive director in Newfoundland, I certainly understand some of the challenges that you face. I guess my first question is, I'll be going to the Grains Council. In testimony last week on the 25th of September, the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada recommended that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency permit Canadian agricultural users to use drones to apply pesticides. Regulatory authorities in Australia and the United States permit such usage. The Assistant Deputy Minister explained that his agency is conducting research to determine if the method is safe for human health and the environment. Do you think Canada should permit agricultural producers to use drones to dispense pesticides labeled for aerial use?
Thank you,
Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, there's a scientific process underway, and the use of aerial drones provides the opportunity, of course, to protect crops, for farmers to protect crops where ground-based application is not viable. So that could be wet conditions, what have you. And I think, this is a good example that sort of ties back to one of our main recommendations around leveraging regulatory best practices and approaches from other trusted risk-based jurisdictions. So in the case of drones, Americans have access to this technology. They have for several years, and we don't. So despite the PMRA working on a regulatory framework for drone technology for the past couple of years, there remains no clear pathway for approval in Canada. So that's an example where there's a divergence in regulatory approach across jurisdictions, and I think that's what we're kind of getting to when we talk about this need for competitiveness. We need to be on level playing field. Our growers need to have access to the same technologies as growers in other jurisdictions, as we are competing on the global scale. So I think that's one example on drones where there's a divergence in approach. We know that there's a process underway right now at the PMRA, but the fact is there remains no clear pathway for approval in Canada where there is in the U.S.
Thank you. Just building on that, so more generally, do you think Canada's more cautious approach to environmental and human health risk than some of its peer companies is appropriate, and do you think that any changes need to be made there?
I would say, when we talk about requiring the pest management regulatory agency to consider food security and economic impacts, we want them to do that without compromising on health and safety. So the key to that is science. So when we're not talking about changing the level of health and safety protection that Health Canada has established as a goal. We're talking about how to achieve that same level of protection while still empowering our sector. And I think, we've talked about the U.S. versus Canada. I think one thing that's important to recognize is we're a relatively small pesticide market. So if you're a global company looking to invest in commercializing new innovation, when you're looking at Canada, there's less market opportunity to recoup those costs. So what we need to enable is a predictable, agile, and efficient regulatory framework. We're not talking about lessening the amount of health and safety protection. We're talking about achieving that same level while also empowering our sector to succeed through more predictable, agile, and efficient regulations. And I think we've seen less focus on that over the past 4 years underneath the PMRA's transformation agenda. And that's also why we're talking about sunsetting that and refocusing the agency's efforts on their core work and core mandate.
Thank you very much again. I'm going to ask CropLife because in a recent article published on September 19th, they say much of the opportunity in red tape reduction lies in the low-hanging fruit. I won't go on to read all of it, and I'll give you an opportunity to be able to expand on that. So can you expand on this and tell the committee what you would prioritise, particularly when it comes to low and no-cost measures?
Well, we'd be happy to detail those. We're going to submit a written submission to the committee because a lot of the recommendations we have are fairly technical in nature, but we focus on both the crop protection and on the plant breeding technologies. And if I may go back to a comment you made earlier, or a question about the drone usage, I think this is a classic example of, as Mac alluded to, where eventually we hope to or expect that PMRA will come to the right conclusion, and they'll make a decision to allow for the use, for instance, of drones or technologies or certain products. The problem seems to be...
I'm going to have to stop you. It's the 5 minutes. I'm sure you can add that in somewhere else. Yeah, just as he's gone a few seconds over his time. Mr. Perron for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have 10 seconds to finish that thought, Mr. Colts.
Quite often the correct ones, it just takes them a heck of a lot longer than they should.
C'est pour ça que je voulais l'entendre, merci.
That's what I wanted to hear you say. I would like to repeat something to the witnesses. If there are things that you don't have the opportunity to say something here, you can submit it in your report that you will submit to us later. Ms. Citeau, I'd like to hear your thoughts. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that inspections should be a little bit more rational when I imagine that you're talking about the inspection of slaughterhouses. Can you elaborate on that? Because I do think that it's quite problematic, it's a heavy process, and it's quite costly. Well, we were really talking about inconsistencies. My colleague has actually a lot more experience on this, so I'll ask him to continue on that. It's the inconsistency with regards to how the regulation is enforced. When we see differences between various regions, then it creates competition. It also creates a problem between the regulator and the industry players. You'll only have 1 minute left, but you're talking about different regions. Are the requirements not the same between various regions, or are you talking about differences between different provinces? There are various interpretations of the regulations, and that makes why there are differences. But in a same jurisdiction, can there be differences between inspectors? It is possible, but we work with the Canadian Inspection Agency in order to help us work with those factors in order for us to reach more consistency. If you have any recommendations to diminish the price of these inspections, it might actually help smaller businesses, and it might actually help if certification is the same. Perhaps you have some recommendations. You talked about perhaps conducting inspections from a distance. I have my doubts about whether or not that can work. We have a way to work with the Canadian Inspection Agency. We also have new technologies that are entering the market that use AI. They help us be efficient in our inspections. That's what we wanted to say. We have to adopt the technology and use it inaudible.
Much. Thank you. We'll go to the Conservatives for 5 minutes, the Liberals for 5 minutes, then we're going to end this round. So back to Mr. Barlow for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just really quickly, Ms. Cito, Mr. Correa, you said that you were consulted as part of the red tape reduction report. Was that consultation, or were you asked to give a submission? I just wanted, if you can clarify what your activity was there.
We've been consulted by the Treasury Board, and we provided a report to the Treasury Board.
Okay. Just as we're talking about specific red tape reduction, and to the Meat Council again, we did a study on this issue a couple of years ago on livestock transportation, where the Liberal government wanted to extend the hours and force livestock to be unloaded and loaded back onto tractor trailers, which puts animal health at risk and certainly biosecurity at risk. There's been multiple studies now that show, by CFIA and AFC, that show that there's no measurable benefits whatsoever to animal welfare with these new regulations. Is the Meat Council doing any work with AFC to repeal those new regulations and go back to the policy that was in place before to streamline animal transportation back to the way it's been going on for decades?
No, it seems we have adapted to these new conditions, but we're not currently working on any effort for that.
As part of C5, I know that you presented to the Trade Committee over the summer, highlighting some of your concerns when it comes to assessment of processing plants on provincial and federal regulatory assessments, I guess. Can you maybe highlight those concerns here for this committee as well? And again, it sounds like the government is pushing ahead with these changes despite concerns raised by the processors. Can you maybe highlight the concerns there?
I will start on the trade side. We've got obligations to report to trading partners any regulatory changes that will affect meat trade. That itself, I think, poses questions in terms of our trade standing in the world. If we start deeming federal plants to provincial plants, I think it raises questions about our regulatory system, and we are going to have to notify trading partners, and that is certainly we certainly don't want people to question the robustness of our CFI inspection system.
If you want me to add briefly, the provincial system compared with the provincial or the federal standards, we have many differences in the 10 provinces and 3 territories. So those standards are going below what we are in the federal standards, and we produce 97% of our meat under those standards. So just to say, 3% producing in the provincial establishments or facilities could not risk what we do at the 97% of our federal establishments. So.
Thank you. Maybe to Mr. Ross of the Grains Council. It is my understanding about 80% of the grain shipments are double inspected. How much money and effort would this save if we were to eliminate that double inspection and that doubling up of that regulation and streamline that process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can't speak specifically to the outward inspection issue, but when it comes to trade execution and the regulatory space, I think a key priority for us has to do with CFIA and their adoption of electronic phytosanitary certificates, or e-phytos. With the rapid digitization of the global trading system, Canada should be at the vanguard of that, but unfortunately, we're well behind the rest of the world and many of our competitors in making this transition to e-phyto exchange. And digitization obviously is a cost efficiency driver, but it will also help our exporters execute trade faster and get paid quicker. So that's, a main priority when it comes to that trade execution piece from a regulatory perspective.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Barlow. We'll go to the last 5 minutes to Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, good afternoon, and welcome to all our witnesses. Thank you for coming here today. Excuse me, I'm going to a little drink of water. If I might start with the temporary foreign worker program. I know it's a big component of the processing industry. I was in a stakeholder meeting in PEI last weekend. Representatives from Atlantic Beef Products were there. They'd be one of your smaller processors, I presume, but they're the only beef processor federally inspected in Atlantic Canada. So I understand that the move from 1 year to 2 years on the LMIA is complicating and adding red tape to processors, to producers that use the program. So could you kind of paint a picture for me? Where would we be if we eliminated the temporary foreign worker program? I would assume it would be dire. Or do you have recommendations of other programs that will make employees available to the agriculture sector?
Yeah, I can talk about the testimony of our members. They use highly the temporary foreign workers program. With this program, I can tell you we cannot produce the meat that we produce today, because we have communities that they have created themselves through those old establishments around many rural locations in Canada, where these people is coming with a very good job and able to have their family there and make work our meat plants. So I can tell our members, when we discuss what to say here, they mention we need temporary foreign workers working as it is today. We've been having some challenges because some sectors abuse on this, but the meat sector is the one that is not abusing. It's a need for us to have this program in place.
Well, thank you for those comments, because I know in PEI, 80% of the workforce at Atlantic Beef Products is temporary foreign workers, and we do have one of the higher unemployment rates in Canada, and those are good paying jobs. So there's people not available to take those jobs. And I guess I'll move on now to just kind of a comment in that I was disappointed to hear that PMRA doesn't seem to have the ambition for change or the ambition to proceed and get to 100% commitment on these timelines. I will tell you that as a new member of government, I am totally committed to removing red tape and regulation for producers and processors so that they can succeed. So I guess my question would be, what other steps can we take? There's a review in process. We hope they'll meet the timeline. You have any other suggestions? And I'll give this to the Crop Council and the Grains Council to make suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it comes from a shift in culture, and that starts at the top, right? And in order for them to shift their approach, I would suggest that it probably should be a directive from perhaps the minister or the government as a whole. If we look at the fact that the cabinet has been given a very unifying or very precise mandate in their mandate letters, I would argue that perhaps the agencies should follow similar guidance there. Sometimes these things take time. Perhaps the departments or the agencies are resistant to that change, but I do believe, and it speaks to what we spoke about earlier in terms of the shift of mandate, if it is made very clear that the economic component needs to be part of the decision-making process, and that is emphasized over and over again, then there's perhaps reason for optimism that eventually they'll follow that directive.
Maybe Mr. Ross, can you comment?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think, I've already touched on how, as a small market here in Canada, relatively small pesticide market, how we incentivize and attract investment. We'll be having, an agile, predictable regulatory system, and we should aspire to be a global leader in regulatory performance by requiring the PMRA to meet 100% of its performance targets. The only other thing I'll add is that we've seen performance decline in recent years. And at the same time, I touched on this already, but the PMRA has been undertaking a transformation agenda, which has been underway since 2021, which from our perspective has had sort of an ever-expanding scope of priorities, little of which has had a meaningful positive impact to our sector. So I do think a step that can be taken is moving on from the PMRA's transformation agenda and refocusing PMRA's resources on their core work, like these performance targets and their core activities, scientific activities, to ensure that Canadian farmers have timely access to new and innovative products and technologies, and to foster an environment where companies are looking to invest into commercializing new products here in Canada.
So much. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today, and your commitment to helping build a stronger agriculture and agri-food sector here in this country. Thank you so much, and we will suspend for 5 minutes, and this ends the first part of our meeting. Thank you so much. order. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee is resuming its study in the government's regulatory reform initiative in agriculture and agri-food. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have Food and Beverage Canada. Welcome. Food, Health and Consumer Products Canada and Union des Producteurs Agricoles. Welcome to our witnesses for being here today. You'll have up to 5 minutes to give opening remarks, and after that we will have questions from members. I'd like to start by inviting Food and Beverage Canada to make a statement.
Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Food and Beverage Canada is the national industry association for Canada's domestic food and beverage manufacturers. Our members include all 6 of the provincial and regional food and beverage manufacturing associations, as well as companies big and small. As I said last week, and it bears repeating, food and beverage manufacturing is this country's largest manufacturing industry and largest manufacturing employer. But the key difference between us and others is this: our industry's purpose is to feed Canadians. Every day, our members take Canadian farm products and turn them into the safe and nutritious food that you see on your table. And while our members are committed to high standards for food safety, the health of Canadians, and environmental protection, they are increasingly challenged by regulatory complexity and duplication. Canada has a good process for consulting on new regulations, but no process for identifying and repealing duplicative, outdated, or unnecessarily costly ones. This gap means compliance requirements continue to grow, even when they provide little additional benefit. For small companies without large teams or in-house regulatory expertise, simply trying to understand how these changes impact them can be a full-time job. Even for medium-sized businesses, a single regulation can cost $10,000 to $50,000 in consulting fees just to comply. Multiplied across dozens of overlapping rules, that's money not being invested in automation, R&D, and energy efficiency. This is showing up in the data. From 2020 to 2024, Statistics Canada reports Canada's manufacturing productivity fell by 7%, even as our trading partners move ahead. Another challenge is a lack of alignment across jurisdiction as well as departments. We see this between the provinces and the federal government. The Federal Plastics Registry, recycling, and extended producer responsibility requirements not only overlap with provincial systems, but differ significantly from one province to another. With no harmonization in place, businesses are left navigating a patchwork of conflicting rules that add cost. And we also see this lack of alignment between departments. On one hand, the government encourages industry to help address food affordability. On the other hand, overlapping rules like the proposed pollution prevention planning notice and anticipated new PFAS regulations that will directly impact packaging decisions add costs that make food more expensive. At the same time, timelines for front-of-pack labeling requirements risk leaving companies, in some cases, with no choice but to discard large volumes of packaging inventory, an unnecessary waste that further drives up costs. This lack of coordination undermines both productivity and affordability. And with businesses navigating a challenging trade environment marked by rising tariffs and doubling down on market diversification, this calls for regulatory agility, not new costly regulations. I will now hand it over to my colleague.
Monsieur le Président, membres du
Mr. Chair, we appreciate the government's regulatory reform initiatives under the Red Tape Reduction Act and the recent progress reports from the CFIA and Health Canada. For example, Health Canada's shift toward a more flexible, risk-based approach is commendable. However, implementation must be accompanied by clear timelines. Without them, the industry continues to operate in uncertainty. And the government's reforms should not stop there. They should also address other regulatory inefficiencies and irritants that create friction and unnecessary costs for our industry, such as repealing redundant frameworks, such as the Federal Plastics Registry, and instead strengthening existing systems in collaboration with provinces and industry. Improving consistency in inspection guides and interpretation across CFIA regions. Proceeding with a phased compliance approach for the implementation of front-of-package labeling. Reviewing Product of Canada labeling rules to make them practical and more consumer-friendly. Most importantly, Canada should adopt a systemic process for reviewing and removing outdated regulations. We recommend a reversed burden of proof model, whereby industry identifies regulations that no longer serve a purpose, and within a specified time frame, the government must justify their continued existence. In conclusion, our industry is not asking for lower health or safety standards. We are asking for regulatory efficiency so that the money currently spent on redundant compliance can instead be used to modernize plants, boost productivity, and keep food affordable. Thank you. My colleague Christina and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, and you saved the committee 30 seconds, so I appreciate that. Next, I'll go to Mr. Graydon, Michael Graydon from Food, Health and Consumers Products of Canada. Mr. Graydon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. FHCP members manufacture 80% of the goods you find in the center aisles of grocery stores and pharmacies across Canada. Our sector employs more than 350,000 Canadians in nearly 10,000 facilities nationwide, making us the largest manufacturing sector employer in the country. We also transform close to 40% of Canada's agricultural output into value-added products that feed Canadians and supply global markets. Today, more than half of the products on Canadian grocery shelves come from outside the country, mostly from the United States. Rising costs, fragmented and outdated regulation, and a highly consolidated retail environment have pushed production elsewhere, resulting in higher costs for Canadians. What we need is a clearer, more competitive path for investment so that we can strengthen self-sufficiency at home and open new markets abroad. In the United States, manufacturing investment per worker is more than 3 times higher than in Canada, and our regulatory burden is the key reason for this gap. When I speak to FHCP members, I hear the same story. Regulations are outdated, inflexible, and out of step with our trading partners. Canada's regulatory environment is more prescriptive and restrictive than most of our competitors. That means the cost of investing in bringing products to market here often outweighs the benefits. Almost all food products must be reformulated to meet Canadian requirements, which adds cost and complexity. Bottom line, unless Canada aligns its rules with trusted trading partners, we will continue to discourage investment, reduce the opportunity for trade diversification, and limit consumer choice. One practical step is to adjust regulations to accommodate trade. This means allowing products manufactured for export to meet the standards of the destination market, even if those differ from Canadian domestic requirements. By relaxing rules for export production, Canada can help its manufacturers compete internationally without compromising Canadian consumer protection at home. Plastic regulations are also a pressing issue. FHCP was a founding member of the Canadian Plastics Pact and the first association in Canada to support the Ellen MacArthur Foundation principles in a circular economy. Our members are committed to reducing packaging, but the Federal Plastics Registry duplicates provincial systems and creates costly reporting without better outcomes. The single-use plastics ban, introduced without coordination with our trading partners, risks disadvantaging Canadian exporters. The United States has already flagged Canada's plastics policy as a trade barrier. There's also growing concern about environmental claims. FHCP supports truthful, transparent communication with consumers, but recent changes to the Competition Act have created confusion and risk for manufacturers. Without clear guidance, companies face rising compliance costs and legal uncertainty. The result is green hushing, where many businesses stop communicating their sustainability efforts altogether. That penalizes responsible companies, discourages innovation, and undermines investment. We urge government to clarify the rules that adopt a practical, business principle-based approach that protects consumers without stifling industry progress. And finally, labeling rules need modernization, as there are too many requests for on-pack labeling that are an ineffective consumer communication technique. Digital labeling offers a practical alternative to on-pack requirements. It reduces costs by avoiding multiple label changes while meeting the objectives of reducing packaging, and provides consumers with information they want in a technological format that they are very comfortable using. Moving quickly here would support affordability, availability, and accessibility of current product information. Mr. Chair, in conclusion, groceries, household essentials, and consumer health products are not symbolic luxuries. They are the everyday goods Canadians rely on. This is an industry that is ready to invest, innovate, and grow, but we cannot do it with outdated regulations that raise costs and hold us back. If we modernize regulations, align with our trading partners, fix plastics and labeling policy, and clarify rules around environmental claims, we can start to rebuild capacity, reduce costs, and give Canadians more secure access to the products they depend on every day. Well, welcome your questions at the conclusion of the presentations.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And our final presentation before we open up for questions from Union des Producteurs Agricoles. Welcome, and 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Paul Doyen. I am the Vice President of the Union des Producteurs Agricoles. I am also a dairy and field crop farmer in Saint-Joseph-des-Érables in the Chaudière-Appalaches region. My remarks will focus primarily on the PMRA and on Health Canada. Their work involves ensuring that registered pesticides, when used according to label directions, are safe for health and the environment and effective in protecting crops. Our organization welcomes the fact that the PMRA's opinions are independent. We would like to highlight the agency's efforts toward transparency in recent years to improve their monitoring of risks to human health and the environment associated with pesticide use. Last winter, Health Canada consulted the public on the regulations amending the pest control product fees regulations, which proposes to increase the annual fees payable by registrants. We believe it would be prudent for the vast majority, if not all, of the costs associated with post-market activities to continue to be covered by public funds. This would lend credibility to the process and help strengthen public confidence in the regulatory system. It must be noted that many issues raised by agricultural producers over the years remain unresolved, particularly the processing times for the registration and reevaluation of pest control products, which were highlighted during the excessive rainfall events of 2023. Such situations have serious economic repercussions for agricultural businesses. Being able to count on a responsive system is essential, especially at a time when climate change is increasing the pressure from crop pests and cases of pesticide resistance are on the rise. We believe that more human and financial resources must be deployed to provide a registration process that is adapted to the realities of agricultural businesses. We have reviewed Health Canada's progress report on reducing the administrative burden and would like to reiterate the importance of demonstrating exemplary transparency in the ongoing process to maintain public confidence. The proposed measure to expand joint international reviews for pest control products seems obvious to us, as several pesticide standards are already the subject of international consensus. This approach would help increase the competitiveness of Canadian agricultural businesses by allowing the registration of pest control products in all participating countries. The proposed measure to exercise continuous oversight could result in reduced wait times and better allocation of resources to meet user needs, particularly in critical situations. We cannot comment on the proportional effort policy mentioned, as its details are not yet known and no public consultation has been held on it. The proposed measure to modernize labels seems at first glance to respond to our requests, particularly with regard to the standardization of information presentation. Agricultural producers refer to the label when preparing and applying a phytosanitary treatment. The least that can be done is to ensure that the information is easily accessible. The current economic climate certainly calls for regulatory reform and rigorous management of public funds. But this must not be done at the expense of the PMRA, the regulatory body that we trust. The resulting reduction in administrative burden should serve as a lever to improve competitiveness and stimulate innovation in agricultural businesses, which are essential to the vitality of the Canadian economy. All of this is a step in the right direction. However, we find it difficult to see concrete gains in the daily lives of producers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presentations. We'll start the first round. We're going to do 6 minutes. We'll start with the Conservatives, and we'll go to Mr. Gourde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question for Mr. Poitras. You talked about the issue regarding plastics. Can you elaborate on that? I'm going to ask my colleague Christina to respond because she's more of an expert in that domain.
For companies, right now, they have to deal with EPR systems across provinces, across the country. These look different from province to province. And then we also have with the federal government, the Federal Plastics Registry, which in most cases is duplicative of these efforts and the information that companies already need to provide. So really it's just an additional compliance burden, an additional cost for companies of all sizes to be able to respond to it. So instead, we would recommend that the federal government play a role in harmonizing across the provinces and across the country instead of duplicating efforts on plastics.
There is a program that exists to help producers. What I understand, though, is that it's difficult to actually access those programs. For example, if you're innovating with a foreign technology, then you're not admissible. However, it is still innovative. Can you elaborate on that?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Here's what we're hearing from our members. The programs that exist to stimulate innovation are either too restrictive or inaudible, or or it isn't applicable to the agri-food industry. We often hear that the technology has to be new to Canada. So often it is difficult to access the funds for these programs. Next question is for Mr. Graydon. You talked about improving agricultural self-sufficiency in Canada. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, we've seen a significant evaporation of manufacturing capacity in Canada. If you look over the last 25 years, we've probably looked at 30% of our capacity disappearing. And as we've gone through the trade issues with the United States, and there's been restrictiveness in regards to access to products, you're seeing, because of our high dependency on trade in the United States, an imbalance of products made in Canada on Canadian shelves. If you were to go back 25 years, we wouldn't be having 55% of the products on shelf being from the United States. Probably would have been 75% manufactured here in Canada. But companies have decided to exit the country and utilize Canada more as a distribution center than a center of manufacturing capacity.
Next question for Mr. Doyon. You know very well that in our region of Chaudière-Appalaches, there's a lot of producers who are impacted by the tariffs imposed by China. Do you have any recommendations?
C'est sûr.
It would be simpler to talk with the hog farmers in Quebec. I would not be able to provide any information on that. With C5, the new bill, certification and regulation in slaughterhouses and factories to facilitate trade agreements between provinces, do you think it could actually tarnish our reputation internationally? Of course, there's some regulation. It's normal to have regulation that is a blanket regulation for the entire country, but I am not a specialist with regards to hog farming, so I would let them answer your questions. With regards to pesticides, producers would like to use more drones, or spray drones, especially in our region. What do you recommend? Some products have not yet been certified for spray drones. First of all, we have to look at the best way of doing things and use the technologies that are available and do so in a safe manner. Mr. Graydon, you talked about labeling and how there's too much on the labels on our products. Can you expand on that?
Yes, with the front pack labeling coming into play now and some discussions with Environment Canada wanting recycling labeling, it's just becoming wallpaper and it's not an effective communication. Today's world of technology, QR codes could provide information to the consumer to make informed choices, and that information could be changed on the spot. Whereas today we have to go through massive changes of redesign of packaging, potentially packaging write-offs, and that can take a longer period of time versus real-time change. So I think our packaging regulations need to become sort of products of the 20th century.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to MP Harrison for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Graydon, you mentioned a clear and more competitive path forward. In respect to that, can you point to any successful examples of reducing regulatory burdens in other countries while maintaining food safety that you think we should consider looking at here in Canada?
Well, there's actually some that have happened here in Canada recently. As an example, flour in this country needs to be fortified. But unfortunately, from an export perspective, going to Europe, there's regulations that prohibit fortified flour. And so it's closed off an export opportunity. But fortunately, because of some intervention with Health Canada and the CFIA, we've been able to free up the opportunity to bring non-fortified flour into the manufacturing process for the purposes of distribution to Europe. And that has been to fulfill an organization that's members of ours that have large assets in Europe, but their capacity couldn't meet demand for the consumer. And they have one of the largest manufacturing plants in North America here in Ontario, and it had the opportunity to utilize that capacity for the purposes of export. So I think those are the types of things that we've experienced. We're also seeing it in plastics. With the new single-use plastics, we no longer can use straws on single-use juice containers. But in the United States will not purchase paper straws. And so we are now working with the government in hopes of trying to get some revisions so that at least for the purposes of export, we can utilize plastic straws on single-use containers for the purposes of distribution to the United States.
Thank you so much to Ms. Farrell. What role does Food and Beverage Canada see for digital transformation and data modernization in reducing administrative burdens on industry stakeholders, and how can the government policies better support the adoption of these technologies?
For companies, anything that can make responding to regulations, responding to CFIA, Health Canada easier. It's not only just reducing regulatory burden, it's also making the process much easier too, switching to, we talked about moving away from faxes and instead being able to do it electronically. My colleague might have more to add.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to add, like pardon, je parle en français.
There's some progress and a progress report that demonstrates that the CFIA will emit digital certificates. This will make international trade more fluid and will diminish human error. So these are steps in the right direction.
And again to Food and Beverage Canada, given the increasing complexity of global supply chains and trade agreements, what strategies does Food and Beverage Canada recommend to reduce regulatory barriers that currently delay market access for Canadian food and beverage exporters?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What our members tell us often is that a free trade agreement does not necessarily mean that they can access the market. It's important that within the negotiations of these free trade agreements, that market access issues be resolved before the before they actually come into place, in order to make sure that these companies can actually take full advantage of the market and take advantage of that agreement as well.
You spoke about a phased approach to front-of-pack labeling enforcement, and I saw your recommendation to a collaborative phased compliance approach. Could you speak a little bit more to what that would look like?
What we are trying to recommend to the government is that we give a bit of a grace period so that companies can make individual plans with their local CFIA offices as to their plans for first using up their existing inventory of packaging versus the firm deadline of January 2026. This is because if they do need to get rid of the packaging that they already have, it's significant costs. It's also waste when we talk about reducing plastic waste at the same time.
Thank you. Do you have time? To Mr. Doyon, is that I hope that's right, sorry. So right now in Canada, and I think since COVID kind of elevated this, that we have a really unique opportunity to buy local and to support local producers. What red tape is making it difficult for Canadians to access locally grown products? And what would you say would make things easier?
C'est sûr que
Of course, that local products are available locally, of course. Sometimes there is regulation, provincial especially, that will, provide a framework for marketing and for us to develop more efficiently that marketing.
Question, 30 seconds.
Okay, you don't have to.
Oh, I think.
Yeah, it's up to you. You're good?
Good, yep.
Okay, perfect. And 6 minutes, Mr. Perot.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your time today. We appreciate you being here. Mr. Doyon, I'd like to hear your general thoughts on delays with regards to certification at the PMRA. You said that we have to be transparent and not, lessen the standards and norms. I think that you are right on that, and it's important to protect safety and health. However, I have examples of certification that took more than 10 years. Of course, that is questionable. Even if I'm not a scientist, I do understand that it was probably put on ice for a while. How can we improve the PMRA in order to reduce delays? What needs to be implemented is a working method that will, free up resources in order to expedite the process. As you said, Mr. Perron, there are some delays that are unacceptable. And then sometimes there are changes, for example, in the climate and so on, that make it impossible to have a speedy decision. With regards to emergency certification, some farmers spoke to us about it last week. Sometimes the certification is given after the emergency is over. Is there a process that we can maybe improve or condense in order to make things go quickly? We should be able to use data and studies that have been done in other countries that should diminish or reduce the time it takes to emit the certification. It would be good to use that during an emergency. Of course, that depends on the jurisdiction. Mr. Poitras, you brought up many elements in your presentation. You talked about more efficiency in inspections. This is something that I'm very interested in. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I do think that this is maybe the topic that comes up the most with your members. What can you do or recommend to the committee? Thank you. There were two recommendations made by our members. The interpretations and the guidelines but are interpreted differently by different inspectors. There could be guidelines that will be followed a certain way in a factory in Quebec, and a plant in Ontario will interpret that same guideline differently. We would like an official mechanism for the organizations to be able to signal those differences so that there are clear answers to the companies so that they can course correct. That would allow us to improve things. We also talk about modernizing certain inspection methods, for example, inspecting virtually. For example, to make sure that labels are applied properly on products. These are some ways that we can improve efficiency.
Je présume que votre
I assume that this idea of having a mechanism in place in order to signal any different interpretations could also maybe allow people to signal inspections that are taking too much time. It seems that there's a lot of abuse there. We all have some examples that we're thinking of, I'm sure. What do you think of that? Any mechanism that can be implemented in order to signal irritants or different interpretations can be useful for the industry in order to make sure that we address these inefficiencies in an efficient and rapid manner. We talk a lot about improving systems so that they are more efficient. In your report and in your presentation, you talked about labeling of various foods. There are a lot of imperfections in that system. I brought this up with a previous department, that there is the cranberry, but there's a lot of sugar, and people are just think that there's a lot of sugar in cranberries and that it's actually bad for your health. To what point were you consulted in implementing these new methods? And when you say that it has to be gradual, can you tell me more about that? I know that there are important costs related to labeling.
We were certainly consulted as they were being developed. I will note, given the extensive resources that companies have put into already changing their packaging, we're to some point past the point of no return. That's why we're recommending that in the meantime, we have a discretionary period. That's what we've been requesting of Health Canada and CFIA, to allow companies use up the products that they already have instead of throwing it out.
Thank you so much. Mr. Epp, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I come from a processing vegetable and grain and oilseeds background, and I first attended industry conferences, I believe, in 1988. Grade, and
il est rallumé. Ferme. Il y a quelqu'un qui joue avec le bouton. C'est encore fermé là.
Okay. Is it on? Okay, there. 1989, Canada Free Trade, and at industry conferences by 1990, we started hearing about the criticality of this word called harmonization. And here we are, how many years later, and we're still talking about the goal of harmonization. And so I'll begin with food and beverage. In your next steps in the document, by the way, very well done, the presentation you made forward, you put forward the next step idea of actually calling for a national summit, a regulatory summit. Is the problem that we don't know the what? Or is the problem that for some reason, since for the last 30 years, we haven't figured out why, like the criticality of doing so? Because I've heard about this for, by the way, just for the record, I was very young in 1988. But I've heard of this over and over again. So why is this so difficult?
As you heard from AAFC officials earlier in the week, the Agile Regulations Table Working Group identified more than 130 regulatory irritants. While they indicated that they've worked on addressing some of these, I don't feel that there's been any transparency as to which ones have been addressed, the timeline for those to be addressed. I think the red tape review reports were were promising, a good step forward, but we recommended the idea of a summit, recognizing that food is different than other industries in Canada, to be able to have that transparency with industry as to how these irritants are being addressed and the timeline for them, which is something that we feel is missing from the reports.
So just to push back on that a little bit more, so how they are being addressed. We heard in testimony at the last committee, let's take the PMRA, for example, they touted that their performance standards, I think, were 69 or was it 79% of their performance standards, while the EPA, another trusted jurisdiction, was only 29%. Can you talk about whether we're talking about apples and oranges? In the first round today, we heard, the EPA is dealing with 58,000 actives, whereas Canada's only dealing with 8,000. Is it a product, is that a function of work, load? Is it a function that we're comparing apples and apples? I'm just trying to get my hands around why we seemingly can't make progress on harmonization.
I think we certainly need a culture change within our regulators. We need, again, as I mentioned in my remarks, we don't have a good process for identifying, even though we now have identified some of those, but identifying the path forward in terms of reducing some of these regulatory irritants. Although we do a lot of consulting, I think we need to take a pause, especially what's happening with our trading partners, and not regulate for the sake of regulating. And I do think that will take a bit of a culture change within regulators to do so.
Mr. Greedon, would you have a comment as to whether it's culture change or it's whether it's specifics that need to be identified as to how we make some progress, particularly harmonizing with our trading partners?
Yeah, I think it is a culture change is a big part of it. And I think the second part, the harmonization, will come once that culture change starts to evolve. And it is almost self-perpetuating, this whole evolution of a regulator. They get one step further and they just keep going down that rabbit hole to the point of the complexity and the challenges that we face as a government, as a manufacturing units dealing with government.
It does seem at times, Canada does have a good, solid international reputation on food safety. Nobody wants to take away from that. But would it be an accurate statement that we seem to be hiding behind that reputation as a justification for our slow responses, for our timeliness in adopting new technologies? I'll start with Mr. Grading and I'll come back to FBC.
Yeah, I would think so, Mr. Ebb. I think at the end, sometimes there's too much of a good thing. And I think the reputational aspect on our regulations is very good, but you can take things too far, and it's now far exceeded. Its investment in regards to regulations isn't providing a return on investment anymore. It's just adding costs, and it is actually starting to restrict our abilities to diversify trade.
On the record with Food and Beverage Canada, and I brought it up the last meeting, I believe PMRA is still only accepting some materials by fax and not by email. Is that an evidence of the fact that we simply don't seem to be able to modernize and move quickly?
PMRA isn't in our purview. It's our understanding, though, from our companies that they are able to electronically submit things now. Unless the national system is down or the file is too big, then they do indeed have to fax it. But it might be different for other companies' experiences.
Thank you. Next 5 minutes, MP Chatel.
I have 3 different questions, but first I would ask all of our witnesses to use the department's report published in September. If you have time, this committee would really appreciate your recommendations based on the obstacles that are mentioned by various departments in going a little bit further and being more ambitious. But we'd also like you to maybe make a recommendation on the delay in which we should adopt these changes. Timelines are often an issue that are brought up in this that is brought up in this committee. Secondly, I'd like to ask Mr. Doyon the following question. You haven't commented for a while on the reduction of red tape. Can you mention or share 3 major priorities for the PMRA and the CFIA? I apologize, I mixed up the acronyms. Can you tell us what your organization's 3 priorities for these organizations to reduce red tape? I would ask my colleague, Ms. Colton-Gagne, to give more details, but we already have some things in place. For example, with the Sustainable Agriculture Plan, the data is already there, and they could be useful for other purposes. I invite Kata to add further detail. With regards to emergency certification, for example, there is regulation on pest control products, which allows for a three-year validity for those certifications, but is never actually applied. Perhaps if we have more time, then it will prevent us from having to redo the paperwork every single year to submit a request when there isn't an alternative for a very specific pest. Same thing for extending certification. There's a lot of documentation that is required in order to complete a request. There must be a way to review that process and lighten the load in order to expedite the process. Thank you. If you've got any suggestions that you can make in writing, that would be very useful. I will now turn my attention to Mr. Poitras and Ms. Farrell. Thank you for your recommendations. You recommend that there should be a standardization of our, we should standardize our agreements with our trading partners. We, of course, have a certain independence, and we shouldn't just do what others doing, but how can we do that efficiently without giving up our independence and our food security?
Monsieur le Président, merci pour cette...
Thank you for that excellent question. As a whole, the reports are a good step, are a step in the right direction, and I think it will be beneficial for the entire supply chain and food chain. With regards to standardization and certification, it's important to note that we have international standards that we base our own on. That's a good way to standardize our systems. We should look at what is happening in other countries and what they have that is aligned with other countries as well. Foreign systems are equivalent to or better than ours, and we should align with them in order to reduce delays that are necessary for certification required for low-risk products and for marketing. For example, for some low-risk products, the delays are 410 days right now. We hope that by acknowledging international standards, we can actually reduce those delays. Thank you.
We'll go to the Bloc Québécois for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Let's continue. I appreciated my colleague's question. How can you integrate standardization, and certification without giving up our independence, but without also compromising on our requirements? In this summer, the agency said that they were going to increase the tolerance level for some pesticides. Of course, I called various producers, and they said, we never asked for that, and we don't even need that. The answers that we got, what we were told was that it was to standardize with other countries, but if that just means that we can import lesser quality products, but increase the standards for our producers, then that means that there's a problem. So we don't want to resist all the time, but you understand what I'm saying here. How do we go ahead without just, doing things willy-nilly?
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. As far as we know, all products imported to Canada have to meet certain requirements that are put in place by the inspection agency. We don't have enough surveillance on how the inspections are done, but our members say that market access in other countries that we have a lot of trade with is not always comparable or on the same on a level playing field. This is something that our members tell us a lot, that there isn't always reciprocity with those countries. On the same topic, Mr. Doyon? Microphone. You are muted. With regards to competition, indeed, when we authorize the use of certain products, it has to be standardized with what's happening in foreign countries. When we import agricultural products, then it has to respect our standards and not foreign standards. Is there a certification that would reduce standards that would not really be a good thing? It would have to be equivalent standards. We have to ask others to follow our lead.
We're going to do 4 for the Conservatives and then 4 to the Liberals, and then we're finished. So, Mr. Barlow.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll try and be quick. And Ms. Farrell, the number of small businesses and food and beverage manufacturers who have told us that CFIA is their largest impediment to growth and expanding their business. It was interesting that we had CFIA here earlier this week, and we asked the question that the government has said you must change your mandate to include food security and economic impact. CFIA said, nope, we don't need to do that. What kind of message does that send to your members and to the businesses in Canada if that's the attitude of CFIA when they're getting direction from the government to change their mandate?
As I spoke to before, I do think we need a bit of a culture change within regulators. More than 92% of food and beverage manufacturers in this country are considered small. Whatever we can do to make it easier for them to sell their products in Canada and abroad, I think we would welcome.
Mr. Green, you had a great quote earlier in your presentation. You say the industry is ready to invest, innovate, and grow, but we cannot do that with increased costs and regulations that are holding us back. Deloitte and Touche did a study on the Liberals' P2 plastics ban, and their study said it would cost the industry about $5.6 billion. Do you agree with that estimate of Deloitte?
Yes, I do.
We also had a study that I remember when you came a couple of years ago, you were talking about front of pack labeling. You said that change would cost perhaps $8 billion to the industry. So we have 2 government policies that could cost the industry close to $15 billion in additional costs. Are these the types of things that are going to allow the manufacturing and food industry in Canada to grow and innovate?
Not at all. And, I think both of those particular initiatives have workarounds that could be done to mitigate the cost impact, still have sort of workable solutions, but at a much lower cost to execute.
Specific recommendations. I'll start with Mr. Graydon. To initiate the culture change, what is, I think back to a saying I heard from a deputy minister, a hog will never slaughter itself. So what recommendation do you have to this committee, and this is not a partisan statement, this problem has been going on through different stripes of government. What recommendation would you have so that the hog becomes somewhat slaughtered?
And I think very much the tone has to come from the top. The Prime Minister has to empower the ministers to put an economic lens on regulatory decisions that are being made with a perspective in regards to the cost implications for both manufacturers, but also the affordability for Canadians. And in our world, that it resides mainly or primarily in Health Canada, which in the past has always not felt that things like cost are part of their preview that health and safety is, but there is a way to be able to accomplish both.
Food and beverage?
We agree with Mr. Graydon. In addition to that, we have been proposing a reverse burden of proof review where industry actually identifies those regulatory irritants and the departments have a certain set time to be able to respond to them as to why they're necessary or how they plan on dealing with them.
Monsieur Doyon.
Microphone is muted.
Sir, you're on mute. Do you want to try one more time? It's not working. Okay. Are you okay? Okay. MP Connors, the last 4 minutes.
I'm going to continue on with that because I like that question, and I've got a few questions here I'd like to ask, but I'd like to hear from the different witnesses today. Is there anything that you'd like to really highlight or that we never spoke about that you weren't asked that you would like to bring forward? You got about a minute, 20 seconds in order to answer.
I would just like to reiterate that companies want to be able to invest in things like energy efficiency, reducing plastic waste, innovation, automation, very much in line with some of the federal government's goals, that could be market diversification, exports, et cetera. But it's increasingly difficult for them to do so when they're spending such a significant amount of time of responding to new regulations. Some of those regulations are redundant, and at the same time trying to respond to what's happening across provinces as well. So that's the message I'd like to leave today.
Great.
Yeah, in a 5-minute opening comments, it's very hard to provide the long list of irritants, but it is massive, and it would probably take 5 hours to be able to go through it. The challenges that I think manufacturing have in this country is that the cost of doing business has eliminated innovation. Canada used to be a strong innovator in manufacturing. We're not anymore, because a majority of the time and energy that's required is to meet the regulatory components versus look at new innovative ways to be able to bring new products to new markets and to the Canadian consumer. So unfortunately, it becomes a burden that is really making a lot of organizations that I deal with take another second look at Canada as to whether this is where they want to invest and whether there is enough return on those investments to be able to continue to operate in this country.
Do we have communication with UPA?
C'est un peu la même chose, le temps est aussi long.
Same thing. As long as we don't have measures in place that favor profit and competition within a same market, then we'll have to try to, have regulations that actually are adapted to our reality.
Question, I guess, to just continue on with the UPA. Is there anything unique, like in Quebec, that we should be looking at? Any challenges that are in Quebec that we should be looking at?
De notre côté, on a également.
On our end, we do have some rules and regulations in Quebec that differ from other provinces. With regards to certification, we do have a role to play in collaborating with other provinces within markets that we work with in order to better compete.
What have I got? Back to UPA again. Artificial intelligence, a lot of happening especially in the dairy sector. Is there anything else that you would think would help to improve and reduce regulatory burden? 30 seconds.
Faudrait voir avec aussi.
You'd have to see with the dairy farmers in Quebec and across Canada. They are the producers. They have more details. AI, of course, will be part of the technologies that will be emerging over the next years, and we should be using it.
Thank you very much. That concludes our business. Big thanks to the members, but also to our witnesses today. I think Food and Beverage Canada is your second time in 5 meetings showing up, so big thanks to you and all of our other participants. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Okay, meeting adjourned.